Morning, everyone, and welcome to another in our series of climate change talks from the University of Lincoln. This is the last in the series of 8, and I'm delighted to introduce two of my colleagues from the Lincoln International Business School. I think we're in for a very interesting presentation today. We have here Professor Ted Fuller, who's a UNESCO Chair on Responsible Foresight for Sustainable Development and works with colleagues in co-laboratories with partners from the Global South on projects related to Sustainable Development Goals. He's practiced entrepreneurship in the business and university sectors, starting his first business at 19, founding 2 research centres at the University of Durham and in senior positions at the University of Teesside and Lincoln, after joining in 2008 as head of the business school. Ted introduced the UN Global Compact's Principles of Responsible Management Education to the Lincoln International Business School in 2010 to engender responsible futures. His current research is on the theory and practice of responsible foresight, and Ted is editor-in-chief of Futures Journal. Now, I'm also delighted to introduce another colleague today, Dr. Claire May. She is an associate professor within the Department of Marketing and Tourism and specialises in sustainability. She's the college lead for the Principles for Responsible Management Education and serves on the University of Lincoln Environment and Sustainability Committee, the Lincoln Diocesan Environment Advisory Panel, and the Lincoln Climate Commission. Claire holds a PhD in marketing, which examined ways to change consumer food purchasing behaviour to become more environmentally sustainable and focused on the potential role of carbon labelling. Her scholarly interests continue to concern pro-environmental behaviour change. So I'm really looking forward to this talk as a really interesting way to end this of our first series of climate change talks. And I'm going to hand over to Ted and Claire now. Please do put your comments and questions up as they talk. We'll have a chance to address some of the questions at the end of their talk. Over.
Good. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Libby, and welcome all. I look forward to sharing some thoughts and ideas with you over the next hour. Focuses on climate change and the shared future of business and society. Now, normally I'm quite well known for a humorous approach where I can take it to subjects, but there really is nothing humorous about climate change. Unless you think the sixth mass extinction is amusing. It's the most serious environmental threat, and it's irreversible. So our intention today is to move from asserting that climate change is a serious existential threat through to B, which is preventing it means a transformed economy, a transformed business ecosystem. So that's the message of the day. If you want to leave now, take that with you. I notice this has been a brilliant series of lectures, and a ubiquitous slide has been the growth in carbon dioxide levels and greenhouse gas emissions generally in the atmosphere. The epoch of the Anthropocene, human-caused climate change. Sometimes called the Great Acceleration, where all the charts look like hockey sticks, starting from the 1950s and growing exponentially, both in terms of the socio-economic contribution, population growth, primary energy use, water use, etc., and Earth systems, carbon dioxide, methane, surface temperatures, biosphere degradation, all of these things measured in exponentially growing terms. And we have a responsibility about that. We're causing that. So we have a responsibility to our children, to our grandchildren, a responsibility to future generations to act for their benefit. And we need transformative change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and systems, services. Changes are needed. How we produce energy, food, move around, consume, live our lives, particularly the richest 10%. We've known about this for a long time, and we've known about greenhouse gas in 1859, Tyndall. We've known about the surface rises since 1896, global warming in 1938, and the dangers since at least 1979, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been reporting this since the early 90s. So why haven't we acted sooner? I think we're suffering from a Cassandran curse. Cassandra, as you will recall, was given the gift of prophecy, prophesied the destruction of Troy, but no one believed her. She was cursed that her true prophecies would not be believed. Now, I'm not going to put it in those kind of prophecy terms, but to think about the anticipatory capacity of humankind is rather limited. Our assumptions about the world don't match its complexity. Our assumptions about human exceptionalism are probably misguided. Our capacity to affect positive changes is trapped by our way of life, which is endangering our way of life. Let's look at the example of why businesses are not changing as rapidly as perhaps they should. So in a 2019 survey of European chief financial officers, what extent is your company feeling the pressure to act on climate change from different stakeholders? And it's perhaps difficult to read the detail of this chart, but what it says is that maybe half the companies will experience some push from clients and customers, maybe only a third from shareholders and investors and competitors, and virtually none from banks and lenders. And regulatory governments weren't by any means the majority, weren't feeling any heat to change from these various stakeholders and power holders. So no pressure then. And in a study in 2000 on about 14 different hazards for humanity, things like fish stocks, radiation, halocarbons, antimicro lead substitute, chemical contaminations. The study found that there wasn't the political will to take action, even if they had all the information they needed about asbestos, for example. No action was taken. There was a lack of political will, and that was the factor, rather than the information about change. So that's whether we can learn lessons from that study remains to be seen. So how do we make sense of the future in the same way that that report did? We imagine, we aspire, we anticipate. And we're rather trapped within the boundaries of our culture and our knowledge to do that. The comfort of normality, our everyday practices, what we do, our short-term imperatives. And we have to learn to think in a new way and act in new ways. And what I mean is, if we have lots of information saying it's going to rain this afternoon, and we decide to go out, we take an umbrella, and it rains, we cover ourselves. We've acted, we've taken action. If we get a weather forecast and we go out without an umbrella and we get wet, well, we get wet. You know, we don't act, so we have to act on the information, and that seems to be the problem. So we've known about the challenges for some time and thought about futures from these challenges. Here's as an example from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, who produced a number of scenarios, which is quite a typical way to think about the future. Possible to address global threats to the ecosystem viability. This is 1997. I came up with 3 different scenarios based upon the particular deep beliefs, depending on how you choose your deep beliefs. So one's the kind of economic deep belief, free markets. Get rich to get rich is glorious kind of thing. first raise our growth, so-called frog scenario. They also developed a scenario about the deep belief of social governance. You know, if you have social governance that can guide markets, you can make changes. And the third scenario was what they call the jazz scenario, which was all about social and technological innovation, many players, free markets, lots, at the same time that jazz depends on the individual, it also depends on corporation. So these were the messages. And the overall message to business was social costs could be passed to business if we don't attend to this. So you need to do something to stop businesses getting hit with social costs. That was the nature of that message. It seems that the frog scenario, first raise our growth, seems to be winning out. And bearing in mind that if you take a frog and drop it into hot water, then it will jump straight out. If you put a frog in cold water and heat it up slowly, it doesn't notice the changes until it's too late. So the frog approach seems to be dominating. Temperatures are still rising. Greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. We're still pushing 40 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Each year we'll be there for 300 years, still rising. Okay, so that's quite... So how do we think about the future in more productive ways? I turn now to some work by George Lakoff and Johnson on how we frame the world, how we use our sort of cognitive abilities to frame the world. It's a frame is a heuristic schema, how we make sense of the world. And being able to understand that and reconstruct that is an important capability. Reframing brings about social change. But frames are largely unconscious, but they also define what we take as common sense. For example, you know, the metaphor, time is money. Time is money. It's a metaphor. And there's all kinds of linguistic twists and turns about that. You're wasting time, you save hours, spend your time, invested time, running out of time, borrowed time, use it profitably. You know, we don't even think about those phrases. They just use them, and it's the way it frames time, some sort of linear value, money. When George Lakoff teaches his class in Stanford on cognitive psychology, one of the first lessons, in the first lesson, 101 kind of thing, he says to the students, I'll give you an exercise. The exercise is, don't think of an elephant. All right. He's never yet found a student who's able to do that, who is able, once given the frame of an elephant, whether it's about floppy ears or a trunk or associated with circuses or going on wildlife expeditions or whatever, once he's given them that frame, they can't undo it. So frames are very powerful. So how has climate change been framed this way? And in asking that question, one asks, whose interest is it to deny or diminish anthropocentric climate change, the Anthropocene? Whose interest is it to reframe that in different ways? And Michael Mann, his recent book on the climate war, frames it that our war is not against activists, that our war is against inactivists, the forces of inaction. Which is an interesting way to frame it. And we've seen in the past lots of deflection campaigns. You know, don't focus on the Anthropocene creation. You know, it's a perfectly natural thing. It's just the sun. We can use offsets, plant a few trees, it'll be fine. What John Urry calls the merchants of doubt, always challenging the scientific knowledge. Or they've been discrediting purveyors of this information, using, for example, a strange and disturbed person who is threatening democracy and is evil. These words appear in press, in newspapers, of certain groups in Australia, in America. Who are they talking about? They're talking about Greta Thunberg, strange and disturbed, threatening democracy, evil. So also shifting responsibility, from corporations and governments to individuals. No, it's not business. It's you. We have the choice. We live different lives. Everything will be fine. It's not going to work because it's shifting the responsibility. So it's reframing. So that's what's going on. And there are various other examples one could give. And George Lakoff talks about levels of cognitive frames that shape public discourse, social structuring. Surface frames puts a focus on the issues, but they connects more to the deeper frames. So climate change versus climate emergency, different ways of framing, or the word consumer I'll come back to. Then somewhere in the middle, there's a kind of issues frame. We assign the blame, we characterize the problem, talk about possible solutions, circular economy as an example of that, net zero, carbon trading. These are terms being used to frame the problem and how we might go about it. And then underneath that are some more deep frames, things we take for granted, principles. Markets are moral, or humans are exceptional over the rest of the planet, or we have dominance over nature, grown from the Enlightenment onwards. Self-identity is important. So when you connect self-identity with consumer, you can see how the surface frames actually connect to deep beliefs in the significance and importance of things. So my colleague Kerry Facer has used this idea of layers and structures in understanding the challenge of climate change. In her particular case, this is related to higher education. But I'll borrow some of these ideas, which are actually drawn from future studies work from Sohail Inayatollah. She talks about headline level, ecological crisis, structural levels, talking about the systems that militate against sustainability, worldview levels, the sort of knowledge practices, how we make sense of the world, and foundational narratives and what it means to be human, and militate against sustainable relationships. So we're going to use those to characterize climate change and our approaches to it, what our approaches should be. Note that the levels of these do interconnect, so changes in one can make changes in the other. And the most garish color scheme I could find to look at these 4 levels: address immediate ecological crisis. At headline level, we need to limit global warming, restore biodiversity. At structural level, we need to address social and economic drivers of climate emergency, climate change. Looking at the worldview, we need to address the weaknesses in our knowledge structures, how we make sense of all that, and our capacity to respond. In at a foundational level, we need to understand what it means to be human in an era of climate change. So looking at the first level, the kind of headline level, which you might frame as net zero, the movement towards it as net zero. The challenge is kind of being framed as an economic opportunity, risk management, rather than threat, which it was. And the opportunities arise from demand, market demand, uncertainty, change. So the metaphors: declaring a climate emergency, unlocking circular potential, racing to the top, resilience thinking, greening the market. Some talk about tinkering around the edges, making a business case. These are kind of languaging associated with that, and images as well. Here's an image of circular economy model, how everything kind of goes around in circles, and we therefore create net zero through that, which is a wonderful scheme. There's been some enormously good work being done on that. And let's introduce you to some cases. And now I can shut up for a moment and let my colleague Claire join the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, so we just wanted at this point of the presentation really to be offering some suggestions of cases of examples where we can kind of demonstrate some activity under these 4 levels. So if we're thinking first of all about what Ted has just been discussing around this kind of headline level, um, just as by way of an example, there's an organisation you can see on the slide here called Carbon Intelligence, based in London. Essentially, they serve as like a consultancy organisation who facilitates low carbon roadmaps for businesses. So if we think about that kind of framing and that language, what we see in terms of the how it's described on their website is that businesses described as the solution to zero carbon economy, not the problem. What they do also, you can see on the slide there, is they provide some lists of numerous companies who have set net zero targets. And these are just a few. There are many examples. So this is being framed as you know, the norm. So if we think about how that relates to that kind of headline level, what we've got is that language, that framing around opportunity, around agency, taking ownership, that kind of empowerment, those kind of ambitious targets. And what we've got is very much sort of actions to address those ecological the ecological crisis, and setting targets in that respect. Next slide, please, Ted. So just by way of a summary about what we've discussed in terms of that headline level, and the kind of actions that we see under that, what we've got is that this type of action is to address the ecological crisis, either by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or restoring the biosphere. Part of that is going to be firstly understanding how the organisation, the supply chain, is producing greenhouse gas emissions, identifying then ways to become net zero. So there's an example there on the screen of the B Lab UK playbook. So what that is kind of a how-to guide, or a series of case studies to help organisations in that. But beyond just that net zero, it's discussing how to be positive, have a positive impact as well. But really the idea here is that in this level there is that kind of clear articulation of a sustainable business performance. So they would need to be able, an organisation needs to be able to measure it, have some metrics and targets around it, and have that built into the strategy. And very much the kind of framing here is around agency and around opportunity.
Yeah, very good. So we'll move to the next level downwards, looking at some of the structural aspects of change and changing towards a kind of net zero position. And how the language is framed here is kind of businesses. The challenge is framed as business is profiting from subsidized resources. The costs are borne disproportionately by poorer and weaker communities. Businesses have a key role to play in greenhouse gas reductions, but they're part of a wider economic system. So we start getting language like green growth, anti-fragile systems, sustainable development goals, transformation, market failure, still using essentially the same business ideas, but looking at the structures. Just a point on social structures. They need not be and will not be as they were in the past. They evolve according to wants and needs. So, are taken for granted institutions what we invented, of what society invented. We invented money, we invented contracts, we invented property rights, we invented taxation, we invented markets, we invented corporations, we invented education systems, we invented government. Society created these things over many years, but structures can change. Institutions can change. So Nicholas Stern in 2006 framed climate change issues in economic terms. Serious impacts, still time to take action, but delay is dangerous and costly. We should act now across all countries. Develop an international response, deliberate policy, 2006. That's quite some time ago now. And, it's a really hard-hitting report that still takes a long time to make effect. More recently, it's been framed structurally as compliance, reporting and compliance. And there's been a history of reporting of what corporations have been doing with regard to their social responsibilities, which has clearly had a checkered past. Now the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, is at the kind of forefront of this work on governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. So structurally, this reporting, what you measure is what you get idea. A champion of that is Mark Carney, who gave the BBC Reef Lectures this year, noting that society's values are being redefined, prioritizing resilience, solidarity, sustainability. The tensions, as he frames it, between urgency and complacency can be resolved. Commitment replaces complacency. Urgency can become opportunity. So again, this framing, but structurally, it's an enormous opportunity to shift as net zero, and that's the way it's been framed. And back to Claire now. It's pass the ball back to you, Claire, for...
Thank you. Yeah, so again, we're going to think about some examples here. And again, these are really just chosen to give a kind of sense of the type of activity that we could assign to this level. So in this structural level, we're considering the recognition that business is operating as part of a wider system. So we're thinking about partnerships. The language very much is around transformation, and we are thinking about compliance, but then over and above that as well. So just a couple of thoughts really in terms of examples and to give a sense of that. Kingspan is an Irish building materials company well known for insulation, but they have other business streams as well, such as rainwater harvesting, flooding control systems, and so on. So they're really positioned themselves as a leader in terms of sustainable business. And what's interesting and why this has been selected is because their activity goes beyond their organization. So we've got that kind of very clear net zero energy by 2020 commitment in terms of their own operations, achieving that through energy efficiencies and renewable energy and so on. But beyond that, then they've also got their vision for sustainable buildings, and showcasing of better buildings for a better world. So actually, by virtue of their product offering, they are influencing the industry, if you like, as well. So their activities are going beyond just their own organisation. The FACEA report that Ted mentioned as well talks about how at this level it's around building communities, sustainable communities, and actually they also have partnerships with schools to kind of invest in that kind of next generation as well. Next slide, please, Ted. So here's another example. This is an organisation called Interface. Interface are a flooring company to kind of do flooring tiles. And again, their activity extends beyond themselves as an organisation. So they have their mission zero, they have their commitment to be carbon neutral across their supply chain, and related to that, they kind of have use waste, run some of their factories from waste materials. Then beyond that, so we're talking about compliance and beyond, so then they're talking about having a positive impact. So they do that through what they call their climate take back initiative, and have a developed a prototype for carbon capture tile, floor tile. But what's really interesting is that they are then talking about how they will discuss their work with others within the industry and within other industries to show what's possible. So again, it's going beyond themselves. They also have what they call the Networks program, and the image is from that program, and that is around taking discarded fishing nets. So again, a kind of waste product in poor coastal communities. They've partnered with the Zoological Society of London. Those nets are recycled. Those nets are then reused into their tiles, and it becomes an income stream for those communities as well. So actually, on multiple levels, then you've got a range of partnerships, a range of environmental and of social benefits. Thank you. So just in terms of a summary then of this structural level activity, within this structural level, we're looking at addressing the social and economic drivers of change. So this may mean moving from net zero and to beyond that. Partnerships and collaboration are important here, but really interestingly, this is kind of the beginnings of looking and addressing those challenges around value, around growth, around decoupling from GDP, and other measures, considering other measures of welfare.
Yes, that's right. I noted that Midas died of starvation as a result of his vain prayer for the gold touch. I'm talking about values. Let's move on to the next slide. There we go. Now we'll look at the worldview level briefly. Currently framed, we would argue, as the Anthropocene, human-caused climate change and loss of biodiversity. There's quite an influential report from Partha Dasgupta, recently published, where he notes that breaking the links between damaging forms of consumption and production and nature can be accelerated through a range of policies and enforcing standards and so on. We start to see metaphors like existential risks, global crisis, ecological breakdown, the hockey stick, donut economics from Kate Raworth, all saying that moving us towards a more acceptance of our relationship with nature, which actually Libby and Harriet did in their lecture in this series, quite clearly showing a relationship between values and human values and nature. Partha's Economics of Biodiversity framed the problem as an ecological crisis. We're facing a crisis totally dependent on the natural world, supplies oxygen, every mouthful of food, but we're damaging it so profoundly that many of the systems are on the verge of breakdown. This is David Attenborough's foreword to the review. So the messages are clear. We need to take account of that because there are currently perverse incentives. Fossil fuel use, for example, is still subsidized. The stock of natural capital is reducing. We're part of nature, not separate from it. We have to include nature, in how we understand the meaning of capital. Produce capital, human capital, natural capital. It needs to be measured, evaluated, and prioritized. And he's looking at figures like $5 to $7 trillion per annum worth of natural capital, which is not being paid for from an economic perspective. Our economies are embedded within nature, not external to us. So let's think about alternative futures, and we'll come to some business examples in a sec. Framing alternative futures maybe a way is the transition. Other words are not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. I don't have the poetic capacity of Arundhati Roy. That was beautiful. So the red line is our current, present, and heading into the future. The green line is where we'd like to be. Managing the transition is what it's all about. John Ury is giving examples of different futures. The business as usual future, where economic growth comes first, the frog scenario, as we saw earlier. He gave example of degrowth, low carbon civil society. He gave examples of the ecological modernization, which I think we've seen in the lectures from Simon and Isabel in this lecture series from Rhizome, and the robots, agricultural robots, but also the way they're replenishing the ecosystems there. And the kind of more fourth areas of more challenging geoengineering, solar radiation management, that what Ury calls a Faustian bargain. So there are lots of thinking about different alternative futures, and these are just a simple example. But one company that's certainly trying to make changes in worldviews is Patagonia, as Claire will now tell us.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we approach this with some hesitancy, really, in terms of giving examples at this worldview level, because clearly it's a huge challenge at this level. But this is kind of a couple of organisations I'm going to mention who are if you're looking at the possible direction, if you like, in terms of reconsidering the relationship and between an organisation and business, between organisation and individuals, and the role and nature of the purpose of business. So this organisation, Patagonia, is a clothing brand, outdoor wear particularly, and it's really been chosen because they have a very active narrative around anti-consumption. So thinking about, that they're clearly making a contribution around changing those behavioural norms. So some examples of the way that they do that is that some time ago now, but they were very famous for having an advert around the time of the Black Friday sales associated with Thanksgiving, saying don't buy this jacket, we're going to, promoting that kind of anti-consumption kind of narrative, buying less. The worn wear scheme is around selling clothes which have been previously used, emphasizing repair and rather than replacement, and increasing the longevity of products. And there are similar examples. There's for example, an organisation called Vitsu who make furniture. Again, they are kind of built on ideas of good design, the longevity in their products. Their ethos is all about living better with less and to last longer. Sorry, there wasn't a picture for that one, Ted. So all these examples are really just to give a sense of the fact that we could start to be thinking about framing that business purpose differently. So now next slide. Thank you. So thinking about a summary of this level, there's an example just on the top of the slide there, a website full of seeds, or what they call seeds, but good stories around sort of a database or collection of these examples, where we can begin to be inspired, reimagine the future, and change new ways of doing things, being very intentional about it, and really reconsidering that kind of considering that alternative worldview. But ultimately, at this worldview level, it's about considering, for example, addressing institutional barriers, re-evaluating, reframing, reconsidering relationships. And some of those examples that we've just discussed are very much reconsidering, reframing those relationships between individuals and organisations.
Mm. Turning to the foundational level and thinking about how we might frame that, I think the framing is moving towards a sense that we are dependent on nature. The ideology of human mastery of nature is consistent with the desire, hope for technical solutions, and it hasn't really been shown to work that well in the past. Clearly, technologies and innovation is hugely important for our well-being, but we have to use it well and use it properly. So climate, in a way, symbolizes that last nostalgic stronghold of nature. And the evident effects of warming give rise to a sense of injustice. Elizabeth Kirk, in her lecture in this series, was talking about climate justice. Humanity's learning what environmental irresponsibility looks like. So we're beginning to see metaphors like leave no one behind in the sustainable development, apocalypse, call to arms, moonshots, planetary boundaries. One of Kate Raworth's phrases, economists as God. That's not engineers. It's a lovely idea. It's hard. I think this is a debating point rather than a set of assertions, but some of our reflections on meaningful human cultures in kind of eco-corporate cultures, the directions of travel might include revising the concept of human exceptionalism, except we're part of nature, not separated from it. Prioritize values consistent with what improves human welfare rather than financial capital. Honor planetary boundaries. Discover ways of contributing to more natural ways of improving quality of life. And reframe, therefore, the purpose and values of markets and businesses acting in markets. This is a debate to develop. So summarizing those levels, at the headline level, we have to reduce GHGs, do that in practical ways. And we saw the lecture from Rebecca Forster where she gave a fantastic range of examples of ways to do that. And there are many more out there. We just have to do it. In terms of structure, we need to remove perverse incentives, measure value differently, head towards net zero business models, circular models, engender growth and human welfare at worldview level, incorporate our better understanding of the future in the present, futures literacy, some call it, reevaluate biosystem services, reframe the relationships between individuals, businesses, organizations, governments as long-term, in there for the long term, responsible for our future generations, and revise our myths of exceptionalism and dominance. Instead, understand we're part of nature, not separate from it. And just in the final minute, as it were, I think of the talk, we might move to just a reflection of how that works out in terms of the business school itself, Claire.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, we've kind of just want to give the last few moments of the presentation to give some thought to how we as a business school are walking the talk. So we've tried to structure our activity around the levels. to try and give some sense there. But what we would say is that actually we are very much part of a broader conversation here around business schools, around their purpose as indeed we're reflecting on the purpose of business more generally. So at the headline level, we report on our progress. So I'm going to say a bit more about Prime Principles for Responsible Management Education in a moment. But really under this headline level, we can say that we do report on our progress in terms of under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, how principles of sustainability and equality and so on are reflected in our teaching and our research. We've been signatories to Prime for 10 years, and every couple of years we have to report on our progress, and you can just see just some of the sort of headshots of the reports that we have done under that level. Next slide, please. So structurally, I said we are signatories to Prime, which stands for Principles for Responsible Management Education. And these are a set of principles which guide our activity within the business school. So that means what we teach, what we research, how we conduct ourselves externally, how we look for partnerships and dialogue to increase sustainability. Our civic engagement is governed by these 6 principles. And so to that end, that gives us, if you like, a structure or a framework to be considering our activities. We've embedded that. Do you mind just putting the next bit on, please, Ted? The images. Thank you. We've got had various appointments to reflect the importance of this to us. So really kind of that explicit investment related to sustainability, and indeed we have embedded criteria related to sustainability in terms of our degrees and our programs. And then finally, worldview level. Again, this is, arguably the most challenging in terms of how we can develop at that worldview level. But we've just chosen an extract from our latest report, which shows a little bit about how we're seeking to develop in that respect. So we're saying that we want to begin an emergent journey of reimagining purpose and practice of responsible business education, and that we want to seek to move to a broader and more critical education that enables the transition to genuinely sustainable ways of managing, organising and doing business. So really that's just emphasising the consideration, the evaluation of the role of business, and therefore the role of business schools, and the recognition of our responsibility in that and that conversation.
Yeah, that's good. So in short summary then, with respect to climate change and the shared futures, climate change is a serious threat. Businesses and society are co-producing the cause, greenhouse gases, biodegradation. Socioeconomic change to prevent it is essential. What we value needs to change, is changing. The institutions of change are sluggish, but moving. The purpose of business is to create value. So reframing meaningful socioeconomic value is the opportunity arising from this threat. And future value creation means a transformed business ecosystem. That's it. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing the kinds of questions that might be raised.
Thank you so much to Ted and Claire. That was truly thought-provoking, a wonderful talk. I think next time I'm really down, I will remember that Arundhati Roy quote, which I think gives us that little bit of hope, doesn't it, that change can come, and that for me was a real gem. The whole talk was wonderful, so thank you. I can't see any questions posted yet, so I'm going to ask one. Because you ended talking about the business school and how it's embedding sustainability principles. So if that's working, we would expect to see our graduates from the university and from other business schools going out and really making a difference, walking the walk as they go forward. Are you able to capture that? Are you capturing that? How does that feel from your perspective?
Yeah, Claire, this is definitely one for you.
I think it's a really great question, Libby, and one which I entirely agree with. In order to know if what we are doing is working, we need to understand the impact of it, not only in terms of a student's knowledge, but also how that impacts on their behaviour and on their efficacy, if you like, within the workplace. And so I absolutely agree with you. So at the moment, actually, I think we're probably in the early stages of really coming up with some kind of a research proposal so that we can really begin to measure that, because it is a challenge. So I've started by just in my own work, started by trying to understand levels of sustainability literacy, and then we need to consider how those things change in a student's journey with us, and crucially beyond. But I think that beyond us is really key, and actually we can, at this moment in time, we can think about what our businesses are telling us as well. If you want to add anything to that, Ted.
Yeah, I will say there's been enormous buy-in to this from staff, from academic staff. It hasn't. I mean, there clearly there's a range of perceptions about this, but nevertheless, there's a very, very kind of strong cultural belief in this work, which makes it a whole lot easier. But we add to that the expectation that each course, each module, or at least each degree course addresses these sustainable development challenges, for example. So it's built into program validations. And we're beginning to see the results of that in terms of what students do, because they have to do that in terms of the course. The extent to which that's carries forward into the world and their employment and enterprise, or whatever they choose to do, is clearly a bit too soon to say. And I'm sure at times their views and hopes will be emasculated by the structures that currently exist, and that's why we have to deal with a structural level. That's no good simply relying on individuals, but collectively we make a huge difference.
I think that yes, and that's all you can do, isn't it? We've got to do our best in the jobs we have and push forward. We do have a question here from Keith Scarrett, which is sort of something I was thinking about. It's a really interesting question. How can any business ensure its future existence by adopting the attitudes that you have explained when competition drives product purchases and investment? Isn't political intervention necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point is it's structural as well as individual. If you firstly, the notion that you can't be competitive and work sustainably, I think, is a myth. I think that the kind of costs of technology, for example, are coming down. The availability of now each industry is different, and but I think the shift is to go, it's a cost. It's not a level playing field. To know it's an opportunity because the markets are opening up and expectations are increasing. But clearly there has to be structural, political, regulatory power used as well. The sense of governance is important in all of this. So yeah, I would agree that it's a whole systemic move. You just can't rely on individual companies to make that difference, although some are trying, as we have exemplified, and doing well as a result of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Ted. There's another question. Mio Yoshizaki. What roles can bank and financial institutes play in reducing the effects of climate change on society and businesses? It was very interesting, your graph that showed that most companies were receiving no pressure from banks and financial institutes. So I think this is a very pertinent question. Thank you.
Yeah. Claire, do you want to have a go? So,
I might defer to you actually, if that's
right.
okay.
Well, I mean, one of the areas is the kind of the reporting, and also the ESG, the kind of expectation of investors to have businesses that operate sustainably. That's probably still going to leave some private equity out, but really the roles that banks and financial institutions can play is massive in that they have a huge effect. So if there are sort of green investment funds to be managed, it's about the criteria used. Why would I lend to this business? Why would I invest in this business if they're damaging the climate? They're going to lose customers. They're not going to. Their supply chain isn't going to be up to what the customer expected. Why would I invest in businesses like that? There's a lot of disinvestment going on from the oil industry at the moment. People moving their money out of the oil industry for obvious reasons. The oil industry is history. Peak oil was some time ago. So I think the oil companies are getting that as well now. So I think they just from a business point of view, banks and investors are waking up to this for sure.
All right, thanks, Ted, and thanks. There aren't any other questions from our audience, and we're nearly out of time now. So I'm just going to, if no questions appear, just remind our audience, if you have questions for Ted or Claire or any of our other speakers, please let me have them. My email address is ljohn@lincoln.ac.uk, and I'll try and forward it on. Oh, we do have one last question from Keith that's just come in. What sort of political influence and action do you visualise is needed to support businesses that adopt the attitudes that are necessary? Real quick answers, if you could.
I think it goes back to it being we can't look at this in isolation, that we need to be considering the joint role. I mean, there's all sorts of examples about should we be legislating, is it carrot or stick, and actually with it probably needs to be that combination.
Right. And I like also in the chat is Luke, who says, oh, I misread it. He wasn't offended by the frog acronym. And I thought he was going to say he's hopping for a more globally conscious
Oh. So there are some humorous aspects, but yes, we've managed to end on a joke. Well, thank you, Ted and Claire. As I say, that was an incredibly thought-provoking, wonderful talk to end up this series on. There will be a series 2. I've written down lots of things I've got to go away and follow up and read up on because, this has been so informative for me. So can I thank you for rounding off our first series of climate change talks. As we all know, COP26 is happening in November in Glasgow, and we will have Climate Change 2, another series of talks leading up to that event, so that we can all reflect on the importance, absolutely critical importance for this planet of that meeting. I'll just finish by thanking a few people. Thank you to all of our speakers. They've all put a great deal of effort and thought into these presentations, and I am so grateful to them. I think they've all been brilliant in different ways. Thank you to our audience, and that includes our audience who are watching this later. We know our audience builds and builds after the talks. So thank you, whether you're listening live or listening another day. Thank you for listening. Please do get in touch. And a big thank you to my colleague Tammy Farley, who's hidden away behind the scenes, but has made the whole of this series work seamlessly. So thank you, Tammy. We really have appreciated the work you've done. goodbye now for everyone, and I hope you have a bit of a break over Easter, whatever you're doing. Bye-bye.